And we are live with Peter Cunningham, founder of Education Post, who now sits on our board, is actually the chair of the board of Education Post, which is now Brightbeam as an organization. He was also assistant secretary for communications and outreach in the first term of the Obama administration. And prior to working that, he worked with Arne Duncan when Arne was the CEO of the Chicago Public Schools. There's probably way more that I could add to the bio because it goes on and on and on. Peter's kind of like the energizer bunny of education, communications, and advocacy reform and organizing. Peter, welcome. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks. Nice to be here, Chris. It's great to see you. And I'm a big fan of the show. I think it's just great to keep the conversation going, especially at a time like this.
Well, this is a special one for me because I'm looking through my email, and exactly 6 years ago, I get an email out of the blue from a guy in Chicago who's like, "Hey, I heard about you. I've read some things that you've written on your blog. It'd be nice to talk to you. I got like something in the works," and that's this guy named Peter Cunningham in Chicago. So I'm like, "Hey, cool. Like, I'm working, like a regular American job. I'm writing some things at night because I'm really angry about education and where we are. I'm part of a little reform community here locally with parents and educators. So I fly to Chicago. We're in a nondescript room, a temporary location in Chicago. And I meet with you. I meet with
Gordon, Tracy,
right?
maybe
Tracy was there. I think that was it, actually. Maybe Mike Vaughn was there. So it's a total of maybe 3 to 4 people. And before I left, I was like, yeah, I really want to be a part of this, whatever. Left, got on a plane, came back to Minnesota, went about my life and my job. You and I talked a few times more. Short story is, by this time, matter of fact, on this day, 6 years ago, you were sending out one of your first staff email and memos that I got from you. I actually went back and took a look at it, and it was all the excitement of starting Education Post.
Right. We officially launched, I think, Labor Day weekend.
6 years ago.
Yeah, there's an article in the Washington Post about it. And, and it was a challenge. I mean, I was asked to start something. There was the general feeling that the reform movement needed just a straight communications operation focused on telling our stories and sharing them. And from the beginning, you were in many ways the model of what I wanted to start to see all around the country, which is voices, authentic voices speaking up on behalf of kids, and whether those kids are in public schools, charter schools, or homeschooled, or any kind of school, really. Didn't spend a lot of time worried about private schools, but certainly spent a lot of time worried about public and charter schools. And I just really believe that that voices like yours were not being elevated, were not being heard, and we're not getting out there. And so it was exciting to create what we created. And here we are 6 years later, and everything's great, right?
Well, I was going to ask you that. So, what did you think you were doing when you were starting back then? And now that you had 4 or 5 years of doing it, and then you've had a year or so kind of away from it to be able to see it more objectively because you're, not in the thick of it. Kind of tell me, like, what has changed? What was your thinking then, and where are you at now?
What I was thinking then was that the conversation, the public debate and the dialogue was increasingly oppositional to reform. We were 6 years into the Obama administration by then. I had left the administration. There was a lot of resistance to accountability, federal accountability, which was, what Arne was responsible for enforcing. There was a lot of resistance. There was growing resistance to school choice, largely because it was succeeding and had moved from a kind of a small idea in the 1990s and early 2000s to an existential threat to the status quo in a number of cities. There was something like 30 cities by then where charters represented a third of the education opportunities available. And, as we both know, teacher unions started to see it as a threat. They were also at the same time starting to organize charters, teachers, and bring them into their union, most notably in Chicago, my hometown. So there was I was interested primarily in just shaping the conversation, balancing out the conversation, which is why I was interested in folks like you, just giving you a platform, amplifying it, and finding others as we did. What I was a little less focused on, because it's not really my lane, is the policy questions. Where does the education reform policy movement go? And we can talk about that as well. I think the Obama administration reauthorized ESEA. I'm calling it ESSA now. That's the education bill that funds Title I, Title II, all of the federal role, which, as you know, is small. It's only 10% of the funding nationally. And that happened at the end of 2015. And, for the most part, it basically handed back to the states almost all of the authority for accountability. At the same time, the choice movement kind of stalled in some ways, partly because I think the accountability grew weaker, or at least that's my theory. I also think the opposition grew stronger, and so the number of new charters, I think, kind of stopped growing, and then so that's what was going on back when we started this. Both accountability and choice were somewhat under siege,
but still a mainstay. It seems like two things were very different that I can think about with back then. Number one, feels like the reform community, for any differences that they had, they were mostly backroom differences. It was a more united between the philanthropists and advocacy groups and the left of center and right of center reform organizations. There was more, I think, common cause. Mm-hmm. Like they weren't working at cross purposes, at least to the extent that they were. It was minimal. And the other thing was Education Post started with choice, accountability, and charters.
Standards, choice, accountability, and standards.
And standards.
Yeah, high standards.
Three things that today, like if you were entering the fray today and saying that those were your three things that you were going to work on, your work would be much harder today than back then, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think standards, I think the standards movement has succeeded largely. I mean, most states now have higher standards than they had 10 or 15 years ago. Most states have some version of Common Core. So there's some alignment around standards across the country. That'll naturally start to diverge just as some states pick up certain issues and drive them. But for the most part, I think the standards movement has succeeded. I think the choice movement has also succeeded. A significant share of kids in America are exercising choice, and actually a really much larger share when you really count the people who exercise choice by moving into communities within school districts based on school quality.
So you don't feel like it's a retreat right now from those things?
The choice movement?
Well, no, I think
the charters in particular is under siege. There's hardly any new charters being created around the country. I think they've been demonized. They've been criticized. In some cases, deservedly so, just for not maintaining real quality and an alternative. The dream of having charters be laboratories of innovation that could then be applied back into the system as a whole, I think, is still unrealized. It's a charitable way of putting it. I think that maybe there's some districts that look at what charters do and bring those lessons back into the system as a whole, like perhaps Denver might be a good example of that. I don't think it's really happening in Chicago. where we have a very robust charter sector, over 100 charter schools, and some
Mhm.
very good ones. Particular chain, the Noble chain, urban prep, taking on, I think, some of the toughest challenges of African American boys in low income communities, and doing a good job with it. So there's a lot to learn from charters. That would be great if the system as a whole tried to adopt. The problem is that systems are just not very facile. They're just not very good at change.
Well, and their political entities. If I just think about Minneapolis, when I started at Education Post, the Minneapolis Public School District was an authorizer of charter schools. And the superintendent then actually had pulled together the best of them and said, let's work on a compact. Let's work together. We're going to share. We're going to take some of our worst performing schools, and you guys are going to help us create laboratories out of them. We're going to make them better schools. And that was the spirit. Then 2 board elections after that, that was all wiped away. The superintendent was made to get rid of anything having to do with any charter school, and to isolate and alienate them and kick them completely out of the district and end all compacts. It was like the end of the Paris agreements. Like, right, that was new administration comes in and says, we're pulling out of all these agreements. And now just there's an ice age on that relationship. It's not because of the charters. It's because of the district itself.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, the success of education reform is a function of how you define success. If success is higher academic performance, there's certainly been some successes over the last 30 years of reform in some places. Absolutely in Chicago. We've been one of the fastest gaining cities in the country. And, I can tell you every single reform that happened in this city over the last 30 years. And it's a combination of some choice, a lot of investment in teachers, a lot of investment in principals, a lot of investment in, things like curriculum, just to streamline it and kind of align it around, curricula that we know works and is good and is, well organized. A lot of investment in technology. So there's been a lot of progress from if you want to call it the reform movement. The other point I was going to sort of raise is that I define success not just the success of charters, accountability, and or choice, accountability, and standards, but how these things are now embedded in the larger system. I didn't only want to say, let's create a parallel education system with charters. I wanted them to be in the mix. I wanted them to be laboratories of learning. I wanted them to be good schools above all. But I wanted the main system, the one that serves 93% of the kids in America, to get better as well. And that to me is real success. And as I said, the fact that we have higher standards in most places, I think is a good thing. The fact that most school systems in America are starting to use technology is a good thing. I think the teaching profession still has a long way to go in terms of how teachers are trained, how they're managed, how they're assigned to the kids. If we had a system, it's not unlike the policing system where sometimes the best teachers and the most experienced ones don't deal with the neediest kids, but end up with the less needy kids because for a whole bunch of reasons that we don't need to go into. We have the same problem with policing. We have the best and most experienced police officers often working the less violent neighborhoods, the less troubled neighborhoods, the less troubled shifts. And, we wonder why we still struggle. But, I don't have simple answers for all of this. As you know, there's a complicated political operation, a complicated political scaffold that results in all this stuff. But
you thought way back when that the theory of change that was needed was that there needed to be an alternative set of voices being raised. Not necessarily the suit and ties, not necessarily the degreed people who do policy, not the politicians, but parents, teachers, grassroots people,
students.
6 years later, you still think that that's the theory of change. That's the way to go.
Well, I I still think it's part of it. I don't think it's enough. Um, I think that the education reform movement uh, does not excel at straight up politics. And for better or worse, politics is here and it's with us and it's not going away. And um, I think we could learn to get a lot better at that. I think that I don't know what how to break through. I think probably an increasing number of people, and COVID is just going to accelerate this, are just going to start to take matters into their own hands. And
Hmm.
I think the consequences of that are there's potential upside and there's potential downside. The upside is that, you know, more engaged parents taking sort of leadership roles in the development of their children has to be a good thing. On the other hand, knowing what we know about, the public school population, we know that there will still be a big segment of the community that still wants the traditional school system to be their system for their kids, and they need it. They can't afford to homeschool. They can't afford to take off from work, so they need the school system to work. And I worry that they'll be even more isolated. And we're already seeing it. The system is completely built to isolate the neediest kids. As you know, we allow people to move into districts that systematically reduce the number of needy kids. We allow districts to secede from larger communities so that they're not responsible for educating needier kids. And and just by definition, we end up isolating kids in troubled schools. And many of the charters, I'm on the board of one in Chicago, are explicitly set up to serve those neediest kids.
Hmm.
Every single kid in the school system is low income. In the school that I'm on the board of, it's in the middle of Englewood, very, very violent neighborhood. Over 50% of the kids have documented trauma that the system is trying to deal with. They're over investing in psychologists because they have to. And so, to compare that school to a well-funded suburban school with very few kids with trauma, uh, fewer kids with special needs, etc., is crazy. But that's the system we built.
And those schools don't get much highlighting. The charter schools that are specifically set up to work with populations that need more assistance, more help, maybe special education needs or whatever, those charter schools actually they're not highlighted as much.
No, except they're accused of segregating, of driving segregation.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's something, help me understand this, Peter. So when you start Education Post, you have this idea that you're going to start a better conversation. It's still in our tagline today. So if you go to our website, you'll get Education Post, better conversation, better education was your thing. Besides the thing that we all make fun internally of that you said all the time, which was more is more. that was your philosophy of everything, and we still kind of make fun of you for that internally. But the better conversation, better education, to me meant a more honest and civil conversation. And then you hire this guy from Minnesota who's a pugilist on Twitter to a lot of people, not to him himself, which would be me, but how did you kind of square that circle of having really aggressive people in your civil thing?
Well, I felt that there was an abusive character to the online conversation. And I often talked about making it safe for people to voice their views. And you, in particular, were someone who was fearless, but you were a truth teller. And the truth is the first ingredient of a better conversation. Civility may be the second one, and but I put the truth first. And there was a lot of falsehoods being perpetuated. That charter schools are driving segregation, or that charter schools are stealing money from districts, or that charter schools are all about making money, or that they don't care about accountability, all this stuff that was being said about them. And this, similarly, all the stuff that was being said about accountability and testing, and, some of the other interventions that were needed. And so, my first definition of better conversation is truth. My second one is that people who disagree can do it without being disagreeable.
Mhm.
And that one, we still have work to do there, I think, to put it charitably. But the truth is, we engage with lots of people. I mean, we had folks like Paul Toner and some of the union leaders who would write for Education Post. We had lots of teachers who were traditional school teachers who weren't really involved in all these kind of reform versus union debates, just wanted to talk about their craft. And I was really honored to give them a platform. We had parents, and you remember those videos we shot in Chicago, which you facilitated, where it was just really honest talk from people who didn't sit around and think about charter versus district. They were just trying to find good schools for their kids.
Mhm.
And we had people like Marilyn Rames, who was just a incredibly civil, first of all, but
Mhm.
very honest about the challenge of finding the right schools for her kids. She's an educator. She wrote for Ed Week. She really knew her stuff, and she struggled to find traditional schools that worked, charter schools that worked, private schools that worked. For all I know, she's doing homeschooling at this point. And her voice was, her philosophy was really driven by her deep faith. I thought that was great. So when I just think about the diversity of folks that we have and that we've given a platform to, I feel really grateful. And I do think it was a piece of the theory of change. I don't think it's enough.
No, I think that's not known so much about you and about the history of Education Post. You were widely kind of just treated as this white guy who
Right.
wanted to do something, who had been supported by people who like to support white guys. But, I was looking in prep for this conversation, I was just looking at the roster. You just mentioned Marilyn Rames, but man, we could name such a odd collection of well-meaning, good, well-educated, experienced people who have real lived experience, who got their start through Education Post or the Education Post network. Like, the reason that people know them or read them or listen to them today is because they came through the Education Post network. So you have to wake up each day a little bit gratified that it's a range of voices and people and stories out there that came through what you created.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the proudest things, one of the things I'm most proud of is La Comadre, which is, as you know, a California-based platform featuring mostly Latina women, run by Alma Marquez, and 50, maybe 100 different voices have been published on La Comadre, and the tone has always been positive, hopeful, honest, tough occasionally. I'm thinking of Letty, and I mean that's just something that didn't exist before we started it, and frankly doesn't exist anywhere else. A blog with that kind of roster of writers and that kind of list of folks, and again, we were also, I think, pretty careful about not dictating to people what they should believe. Certainly, we chose people who were open to reform ideas, but we were not limited to them by any means. We welcomed, honest debate from anti-reformers. We welcomed honest debate from sort of extreme choice zealots, as I call them. We were open to everybody, and I just think that's what you should be in America. A place where everybody feels safe to say what they want to say, and I think for the most part we achieved that. I don't think we were perfect by any means, but so much of the social media conversation, as you know, is sort of self-reinforcing. People just get into smaller and smaller bubbles where they all just sit there patting each other on the back for what they believe, instead of reaching across and saying to someone who disagrees with them, how can we find some common ground? How can we connect? And you know, there were the number of times where I brought in, say, union leaders and said to them, how do you feel about charters? Turns out they weren't really against them. Quite a few of them had their kids in charters.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? But politically, they had to toe the line, and
No,
that's their job.
it's one of the things that I both appreciated about you and have appreciated about you and haven't understood at the same time is your ability to like sit with people that are so opposed to everything that you stand for and have ongoing relationships with people who couldn't be more opposed to the way that you see the world, and you not have a problem with it. Like, and even to the extent that some of them, I mean, like you collected a lot of criticism, right? Education Post did. Like, here I was on the inside seeing a group of people that were rightly motivated. They weren't motivated by any malice or any type of ill will towards anything, anywhere, being painted as some sort of like laboratory of nefarious policy ideas of some sort. I mean, did you ever like stop and think that like that you were, I don't know if it's, I wanted to say that you were being taken advantage of, but I don't know if that's the right way, that your grace extended to them wasn't being returned to you?
Yeah, I sometimes felt that way. And then I just mostly felt that, it's kind of like what Michelle Obama says, they go low, we go high. I just tried to mostly go high. And I realized that that's not always easy to do. And it sometimes makes you feel weak or makes you feel like you're giving in when you don't really want to. And I get that. But, for the most part, I don't have, real hate for any of these folks. They have to do what they have to do. It's unions are a special kind of animal, right? They're paid, they're supported by their own members, and they have to advocate for those members no matter what, even if they're not doing the right thing. That's their job. And if they don't do that, they'll be voted out and they'll be replaced by someone who will. So, embracing that reality is part of growing up, so to speak. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that we have to give in. I mean, the reason why I was so excited to, first of all, hire you, but then more importantly, to hand the reins over to you is because, you bring to this thing a level of authenticity, frankly, that I don't have. My children attended a Magdalen High School in Chicago, but they're not the ones who are suffering from the shortcomings of our education system, and they have a personal safety net that's gonna help them. There's too many people in America who don't have that, and they need to be represented. And for the most part, they're not represented. Nobody's really fighting for them the way they're fighting for the system.
What was your reception like with other people that were likely like situated in the same way that you were within the reform movement? I mean, there were other people that didn't have the grassroots kind of, urban school experience or, whatever, but they had similar experience to yours. And here you are in rooms with them also. Like, we had to negotiate friends, allies, partners, some who believed in what Education Post did, some who didn't. And how do you see yourself situated in that group?
I've always seen myself as the guy who helps explain things. That's my skill, so to speak. I'm a writer. I'm somebody who tries to stand apart a little bit and say, here's what we're trying to do, and here's what I think it means. But I also recognize that my own lens is limited. So many times I looked around in some of these meetings that we had in the reform community, and I didn't see people like you in the room. And I often said to myself, okay, what's wrong with this picture? I didn't really ask the question. I knew what was wrong with the picture.
You weren't a big fan of those rooms. I just want to point that out.
You are?
No, you weren't actually, as I remember it. You would be
No,
invited to these things. You would go there, and I'd be kind of like interested. Like, it's interesting to me that you're being called to that. Tell me more about it. And you weren't a big fan.
no,
It wasn't.
I felt like I felt like we're all really well paid, and we're thinking about what we want to do here, but we're not really reflective of the people who who the system is set up to serve, is supposed to serve, and is ill-serving. And that I think is a flaw. Now I think we made a lot of progress, and I think that there's more diversity in the reform movement today than there was when Education Post started, and certainly years earlier. And there were always pioneers from Jeff Canada to Howard Fuller, and so I don't want to be overly harsh about this. I just think that
Mhm.
it's the kind of thing you just have to work twice as hard. You have to overcorrect for it. And as you know, I worked very hard to overcorrect for that by reaching out directly to people of color, and just people who people like our friends in Detroit and in cities that really didn't have the kind of support. And there was certainly a bias in the funding community towards folks like me. They saw as former federal official and somebody who's seasoned. And I think that everybody has a role here. You look at any of the other reform movements underway today, and there's authentic grassroots voices, and there's also professional advisors
Mhm.
trying to help them avoid some of the mistakes that movements make. Movements are not there's no textbook, there's no formula for how these things succeed. They succeed through mostly hard work. And my hope is just to help find clarity. And here we are in education. So
Mhm.
30 years after the reform movement started, 1990 maybe, the modern age of reform. Certainly some people could go back into the 80s, and talk about
Nation at risk.
a nation at risk,
Yeah.
and then they go
Yeah.
back to the 60s and the math wars, and all this other stuff that your good friend Diane Ravitch has written about. But I
Yeah.
mean, I sort of date ed reform to the about 1990, the start of charters, the start of Teach for America. The growing, the movement towards mayoral control. At least it happened in Chicago in 1995. Just to, uh, that's where that's where I sort of
Yeah. It
begin.
doesn't feel like a movement anymore, though.
No, it
To be
doesn't
very
feel
honest
like a
with you.
movement.
Mm-mm.
Yeah,
Feels like atomized, feels very tribal, feels partisan, um, in ways that
yep,
it hadn't been before. Um,
absolutely.
and I think everybody blames the other for why it's not bipartisan anymore. You have the thing you watched, kind of this thing emerge around, well, it's the social justice warriors who came into education reform and ruined it all for everybody.
Right.
You know, if they hadn't showed up and started talking about that race stuff,
Yep.
we would have had a good movement moving forward. That started a few years ago, maybe 3-4 years ago. And today it just feels like what was a movement now is really a loose collection of individuals who have a somewhat similar goal, but not really.
Nope, it's not a movement. I feel like a lot of choice advocates sort of abandoned accountability and felt, what, let's let's not worry about that. Just the only real accountability is parents choosing. And so suddenly you get away from that. I think a lot of folks no longer believe that intervention in traditional schools was possible.
Mhm.
And as I said before, I don't think the solution to education is that 50 million kids all go to charter schools. I think that charters are a great piece of the puzzle. And I think that figuring out how to improve traditional schools is also necessary. It's a much faster path towards progress than thinking we can charterize the whole world. That was never my
Mhm.
agenda.
Mhm.
Um, but there was an awful lot of people who dismissed um, like the SIG program that the Obama administration funded, that, focused on hundreds of schools. I can't remember all the numbers anymore as well as I used to, but we gave real money, up to $6 million to hundreds and hundreds of schools around the country, and so that they could figure out some way to improve the school. And we gave them a lot of flexibility, and some of them did a good job, and some of them didn't do a good job. And then some reports come out that often are tilted by the agenda of the report writer or the report funder, and saying it didn't work. Well, you know what? It worked in some places. It worked where people did it with fidelity, and it still didn't work everywhere. But that doesn't mean you give up. You don't give up.
I think there's a lot of fanfare with the original reports saying that it didn't work out, and then that the grants didn't do what they were supposed to do. And then when there was subsequent research that came out to say, well, nope, that's not really true. Actually, it worked more. There was not the same level of energy about lifting that up.
Yeah. And, so suddenly it's like, okay, we never want to do school interventions anymore. Well, really? Okay. Wow. So that's not an honest policy conversation. That's not a productive policy conversation. That's driven, I thought at the time it was driven by guys who only wanted to push choice. And therefore, if interventions worked, that would weaken the case for choice.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that kind of zero-sum thinking is crazy.
I actually think that there was something else at play. You and I've talked about this before, but it seemed to me there was cognitive dissonance for right-wing people and for conservative educators or conservative reformers in this one way. When you had one of the most successful Democratic Black presidents in history pick up on ed reforms, many of them, and championing them and run to the hole with them, it became kind of hard to keep supporting something that had the name Obama on it.
Absolutely.
So all of a sudden, some things that you had always supported all these things, became bad because that Obama guy did them and picked it up and made it really hard.
No question about it. Folks he was absolutely advancing the agenda of centrist Democrats and Republicans with our policies on choice, our policies on accountability, and our policies on school interventions, et cetera, and yet and standards especially, and the sort of the conservatives started to abandon him very quickly because for all kinds of reasons, federal overreach, politics, the Tea Party politics. That just felt dishonest to me.
And it's still,
lamenting politics is kind of a fruitless endeavor. I mean, politics is here to stay, and you just got to get better at it. And I think the education reform movement needs to get better at it, which is not to say that we've failed miserably. I don't think we failed miserably, but we're not built to stand up to the status quo right now.
I think we have too many thinkers.
Too many thinkers?
Yeah, we got too many thinkers and think tankers and people who have like a lot of time to sit around and navel gaze and to 1 year before something and the next year be against it. The opposition is long-term. The opposition is long-term and pretty set on its core principles. They do not sit around asking questions like, hey, do you know I wonder if this seniority thing has outlived its usefulness, right? I wonder if this collective bargaining thing, maybe we should try it a different way. They have no kind of, they have no dissonance in their thinking over long periods of time. But yet we have people who were just vicious standards people who became kind of wavy gravy about standards. We have people that were super testing fans and test-based accountability until they weren't. Until the test results for some of their favorite schools came back bad, and then all of a sudden tests didn't matter anymore.
Exactly.
And I don't know how we get consistency on our side when you have so many people thinking. It's just thinking. That's what I do for a living. I sit around and think all the time.
Right. Too many Chiefs, not enough Indians.
Right. Now you're going to get trouble for that.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's probably.
But I actually just don't think that we're served well by people who who can think one thing this year and then next year put out a different report and go a different direction, and the year after that, and the blame for the disintegration of ed reform, I think, largely has been put at the feet of the social justice folks who came in without any self-reflection on the other side of saying, well, first of all, that should have been there all along. Like, you don't want to just set up millions of schools in places where you don't have a presence. Right. I mean, like, you don't want to colonize neighborhoods and cities with your schools necessarily, if you want them to last. Right. Because people don't like to be colonized. You know, what you and I saw in New Orleans when we went down there, we invested time and energy in talking to real people to get underneath the story behind the story. And the biggest story was, you can even give people something that's useful to them that they like, and they still won't like being colonized.
Absolutely. And that's kind of just the way we think all the time. I got the idea for you. Let me do the thinking, and you just enjoy this. And you know, empowering people, I think, is just the foundation of democracy, and it's just constant tension between empowering folks, and then people get empowered, and then them not releasing that power to the next generation. You know, I mean, we have people who enter politics in their 20s and 30s and stay until their 80s. You know, I mean, the Democratic candidate for president, who I'm a big fan of, who's a great guy, you know, is a career politician. That's okay. He's the right guy for the moment, or he's the guy that the Democratic Party chose, and I stand with him. Doesn't mean we agree on everything, and you know, obviously he's, especially on our issue, you know, he's responsive to the politics that's you know, countering some of the reforms we support. You know, that's just the way it goes.
What are you taking when you look at him, though? When you look at him, you and I talked about Hillary Clinton's race, you know, almost 4 years ago. And we were having a little bit of, you know, discussion about the fact that she was slightly stepping away from her previous support of reforms. She wasn't making a bold kind of break. It just was an uncomfortable silence on things and a stepping back. Because both Clintons had been, you know, big supporters of charters. And now all of a sudden, her working with Randy Weingarten, they shaped her up to be a candidate who would mute that. We have something totally different this time around. We have a guy from the Obama administration who was there in the middle of the thick of all of the reform, who has now joined the Bernie team in some ways. I mean, if we're just being real, if we're just putting it out there, this is a big difference than when Clinton ran 4 years ago.
Well, you know, I tend to not overinterpret this stuff. You know, as you know, the federal role is fairly limited. You know, there's all this talk about this $400 million charter startup program that might get taken away. I just don't think there's there's anything to worry about there. I mean, this is in the big federal budget. This is what you call a little cat and dog. This is a nothing program. It's tiny, and there's no way. And there's a strong advocacy group for it, and it's very popular with Republicans. And I just really doubt that a Biden White House is going to, you know, go to the mat over this program. On the other hand, he's talking about tripling Title I funding, which is far more meaningful to the communities we serve, or that we care about, I should say. I'm not in education directly anymore, but you know, so you know, I think that it's rhetoric is one thing, but at the end of the day, getting more funding into schools, I think, is a great thing. And so, you know, and I don't think that charter is going to go away. First of all, as you know, they're authorized at the state and local level, and that's where the fights are. And certainly we've lost some battles there, but we've won a lot of battles too. And as long as we produce good schools, I think the choice movement is going to be fine. The charter movement is going to be fine. We just have to keep on producing good schools and giving parents and empowering parents to make those choices. And I think they will make them. And, you know, a lot of people are going to continue to choose the neighborhood school. It works in a lot of ways. It's down the block. It's free. It serves kids no matter what their needs, as many charters do. So, you know, I want it all to succeed. I don't have a definition of success. that is focused just on choice or accountability. I want both. I want high standards, and I want parents to be empowered, and I want teachers to be supported all at the same time.
As a person who's been in communications for so long now, think about it with that lens. The idea that you would have, and I'm just going to call names here, you have people like Jeff Bryant and others who have a career in communications. So they're waking up every morning and going to bed every night thinking about how to win communications battles. To go from a time period where Democrats were championing charter schools as schools of hope, schools of opportunity, schools that created an additional...
Union leaders were championing them.
Union leaders and Democrats for sure were of the mantra, like these are schools of hope, to being schools that need to have a moratorium, schools of fraud, schools of broken promises, is a communications victory. It is a huge communications victory that probably took years. But if I was responsible for that, I would feel very... I would up my fees.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Jeff's an effective guy, and he's really, like you say, he's dedicated to his message, and nothing's going to take him off of his message. Look at the other side, though. Starting with a nation at risk, and for many, many years, there was a very robust conversation underway around the shortcomings of the education system, of the traditional system. And that conversation, is, first of all, it's true. But, secondly, it led to an awful lot of change. So the fact that there's some pushback to it is sort of to be expected. But, there's a really, really widespread understanding that there is such a thing as educational quality, and that the people in the system vary, that, investing in principals, investing in teachers, holding them, accountable, does have positive outcomes. At the same time, we know that you can't always shape all those resources or drive all those resources in the direction you want to. Going back to the point I made earlier, you don't necessarily have the ability to get the best teachers in front of the neediest kids. You just don't. Whether it's the teachers themselves choosing to work in schools that are not as challenging, and I don't fault them for that. I mean, they're making personal decisions themselves. Whether you have the fact that the teaching corps is not as diverse as it should be, whether you have just the inability to assign teachers, and those are things that are just outside our control, and there's not always much we can do about it. You're on mute, I think. Is that possible?
On mute.
Yeah, there you are. I got you.
Yeah.
I got you. Yeah.
You have said often that, like, you don't get to just poke a bear and not think that there's going to be a response at some
Correct.
point. So maybe reform got a little too happy with itself and forgot the fact that it was poking a big bear that would eventually slap back. And now when they're slapping back, we're kind of freaking out a little bit. Like, oh my God, I can't believe that they've returned fire.
Yeah, I'd love to see the reform movement go back to the idea of helping the overall system get better, not just creating a parallel system. And I realize that the reform movement is very broad, and it's not just creating a parallel system, but there are some segments of it that are only interested in a parallel system. It's okay. That's what they want to do. That's fine. But I think, broadly speaking, I'd like to see the reform movement spend more and more time just helping the overall system get better, with clearer standards, with better training of teachers, better support for teachers, better engagement with parents. And I think the one thing, if there was one big area that I'd love to see us get much better at, and here I give Biden some credit. He's talking about it on his education platform. It's birth to 5. I mean, we continue to have a system where kids show up in kindergarten 3 to 4 years apart, and we spend the next 13 years trying to close that gap, and we're just not very good at it. And if we spent if we put a lot more energy trying to close the gap between birth to 5, they'd show up in kindergarten a little bit closer, and the entire K to 12 system would spend less energy trying to close the gap and more energy just lifting everybody. But we just don't invest in birth to 5. Biden's talked about it, so I'd love to see where that goes. I've talked so many times about how early learning is the best investment we can make, but I think it's even more than that. I think it's birth to 5. It's healthcare. It's all the things that give a kid a chance to show up on kindergarten ready. And
what I find a little bit suspicious about that line of thinking, and this isn't about you, this is just about in general. That child is born, mother has a baby, that child is born. There is a continuum of places and spaces and actors who are going to be helping get that child from birth to post-secondary. Mm-hmm. And you are absolutely right. On day one, there are already inequities in maternal health, mm-hmm. and the birth weight of babies and how well they're taken care of in their first year, and things that they have access to that are dependent on economics. Absolutely. And then when it comes to the learning years from 3 to 5, like where there's some real brain activity starting to happen or whatnot, yep. There's some inequities there. Yep. Absolutely. Childcare is a mess in the United States. Absolutely. Like the talk about the savage inequalities when it comes to childcare, yep. Where people with money and people who don't have money put their kids in childcare, create two wildly different learning universes. Got it. K to 12 education, though, is prime time. That's like when things are really happening. And that is the system that is most resistant to change. So what I think politicians do a lot of times is they want to talk about free college and early childhood education so that they can get away from having to talk about a unionized K-12 system that still needs better teaching, better teachers, better instruction, better pedagogy, better programs, more accountability for the money that it spends, more accountability for it's things like pensions and the business operations and everything. So if I was running for office, I would want to leave that alone. I'd want to leave those the in between early ed and post-secondary. I'd want to kind of just ignore that and just say, hey, I'm going to give you guys some more money. And then let's just call it a day.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. That it's a bit of a dodge to talk about birth to 5 in college and leave aside the big elephant in the middle there. Yep. But I just truly believe it. I just truly believe that kids show up 3 to 4 years apart at the age of 6, and that the system spends the next 13 years trying to close that gap, and that it would just be good to try and close it earlier.
Do you ever have moments of doubt? Like you're always kind of I think positive and
the time.
Yeah, and believe. Do you ever have moments where you're like, this is what choice people are starting to come to. Maybe all bets are off, and we should just give parents the choice to choose whatever they want, because smart people are going to argue about all of these policies forever. And it's never going to stop being an argument about assessments and data and testing and, all that. So why don't we just give parents the choice to choose whatever they want while smart people argue about what policies are best?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I think about is that I guess they call it Campbell's Law, this law that whatever you decide to make is important will pervert the system towards that. So, it's the argument against testing a lot, that we made testing important and therefore the system became aligned around testing and, test prep and tests aren't really, reflective of all subjects. They're not reflective of, real learning. They're just reflective of drill and kill. And I don't know how to change that. A lot of people have talked about coming up with a new accountability system that is focused on grades. And I'm like, I'm wide open to that, but we all know what that could lead to.
Right.
A lot of people talk about accountability systems that are focused on student work. I forget the term of art now. Sure, but I mean, Campbell's law may apply there as well. So
I think Campbell's law is a fraud.
you
Just in
do.
this one way, like, making fidelity important to marriage creates cheaters. It makes men cheat on their wives. Like, so whatever you make important is going to pervert a thing towards a bad thing. So fidelity is important in marriages, but we shouldn't make it super important because it's going to cause people to cheat, right? Like, that's kind of what it feels like. The measurement itself is not the problem. The measurement and testing, like making testing important, is kind of like saying a blood pressure test is making it about everything, making all your health care about that one little thing. But that one little thing could give you a heart attack and you can die.
Yep.
As someone who have figured out the importance of blood pressure over the last couple of years, and the gravity of that situation, I take that a lot more serious now. Like, the fact that we do that blood pressure doesn't tell me everything, but it tells me enough to keep myself alive.
I mean, that said, that's just an area that I'd love to see more and better ideas. What's a better way to hold ourselves accountable? And I think testing will still be a part of it, but I'm just wide open to other ideas. I think student attendance is a relevant factor. I think grades actually are relevant, and I think that student surveys, parent surveys could be part of it. In some ways, it's more is better. You and I are both on the board of great schools.
Yeah.
And great schools has a rating system that's based on a lot of factors. Some have accused it of being overly dependent on test scores, and they're working to address that, and that's great. So I just think that we know more and more, and the more we use that knowledge to better define what a good education is and what good outcomes are and how to achieve them, the better we're going to be. And the system isn't very facile, right? It just doesn't adapt very quickly. Some charter schools do, which is why I support them. They're small, they're nimble. They can adopt new policies quickly. They can evaluate them and change them if they're not working quickly. Whereas, the big systems really can't. It takes them 5 years to roll out a new policy and 15 years to evaluate it and 50 years to change it. And, so here we are with a school system today that in many ways looks like the school system of 100 years ago. And we have to keep
fighting for better.
Yeah, and we wonder why progress is slow.
Well, in our final moments here, final wrap-up minutes here, want to return to like where we started. So you had an idea, you had a positive attitude, you had a theory of change, make a better conversation, make it safe for reformers to be openly and honest about the fact that we need reform and change, and to build platforms and to give platforms to people who are unheard, make people heard in places where they need to be heard. So that was your message into the world. Like, you put your time, your effort into that. You built something, you built the platforms. It's kind of like I came, I saw, I left. You did that part. And your message into the world has been this large network of individuals who have gone out and caused trouble by interjecting new voices into rooms where they weren't before. So I think you have to be pretty gratified about that message. But now you also had a little bit of time away to look at a completely different issue, criminal justice and workforce development and other things. So it's almost getting like a palate cleanser. What would you say now, having been, gotten out of it a little bit, being able to be a little bit more objective? What's your message that you think is the message that all of us that are still in the thing need to hear and should run with?
Oh, I very much believe that the people running our schools and the people teaching in the classrooms are still the essential players in this, and the more we can strengthen them, empower them, and help them succeed, the better. And that doesn't mean, just letting them do whatever they want, but it means giving them the support to be successful, holding them to a higher standard, training them better. I think that the best and only hope is that the principals and teachers that we hire and support are able to excel at their work. When you see a great principal who comes into a school and turns it around and builds a culture of learning, I mean, that's worth $1 million. And when you see a terrific teacher who loves her work, his work, that's the ball game. We can't solve these. At the same time, we have to keep trying to solve the bigger societal problems, racism, poverty. But they're not going to get solved overnight, and they may never get solved, to be honest. But you can create a learning culture in a school and in a classroom that is still outstanding. And if we did nothing else, that's our job, is to create a learning culture that works for kids. And too often it doesn't. But I think it's possible, and I've seen it. I know it's possible.
You're always the optimist.
I am an optimist.
About you.
I am.
Hopefully, some of it rubs off on me at some point.
Peter, thank you. We all have our roles, man.
Right, and this one's yours, is to be happy about these things. Thank you, man, for coming on today. I appreciate it.
Sure, anytime.
I just want to say to people watching and listening, I'm very grateful to Peter, number one, for coming here today and just helping kind of set the record straight on some things about our history at Education Post, but just in general for being kind of a constant supporter, a constant, unwavering source of support. Happy to call him a friend and a backer and someone who genuinely can be trusted to have your best interest at heart and at mind at all times, regardless of whatever is going on in your life. Peter's the founder of Education Post, did so much more before that, but I'm actually pretty satisfied and gratified by being an Ed Post alumni and now leading an organization called Brightbeam that came out of the Education Post experience. And every day I look at my team, which is your team too, Peter. And I'm gratified by the fact that we have engaged, smart, strong people who are working together in a very therapeutic culture, in a work environment where people are appreciated and appreciate each other. And if you could just see the level of work that they do every day to support each other and to produce results, I think you would be very satisfied, very gratified with what this team is doing. And who we've become and the thing that we are. It's the reason I'll stand up for my team against all haters, because we have such good people, talented, smart, engaged, compassionate, honest, supportive of each other, open to different viewpoints. We have everything from, libertarians and conservatives to liberals and Democrats. And we have people across the spectrum who work in a small team, a small slice of the world where it all works, where we can get along with each other and we can produce something great. And that comes from this guy, Peter Cunningham, the shop that Peter Cunningham built and that I'm happy to lead now. So Peter, thank you. And thank you to my team, who I'm sure are watching right now and enjoying this conversation. And thank you to everybody who comes here every day, gives us an hour of your time to discuss education. Appreciate you all.